Welcome to A Magical Life, Health, Wealth and Weight Loss. I'm your host, Magic BARCLAY, lead practitioner at Holistic Natural Health Australia and #1 best-selling author. In this podcast, I aim to give you practical tips on how to accelerate and sustain your health, increase your financial, spiritual and emotional wealth, and to look at something that haunts many of us needlessly, weight loss. In some episodes, I'll have guests available to give you even more tips, but in others, the floor is yours. Drop us a line at A Magical Life Podcast on Facebook and let me know what you would like to know more about. Now, sit back and enjoy, because it is time for you to create and truly discover a magical life. Welcome back to A Magical Life. I'm your host, Magic BARCLAY, and this is your episode 96, The Science of Fear. We all experience fear. These days, many of us have fear as an automatic setting in our lives. And whether you believe that's created by the media or fanned by the media, whether it's government, whether it's friends, families, the situation going on around you, fear is actually normal, but it's not normal to be in a constant state of fear. So I thought today I would go through some of the science of fear, just so that you, the listeners, can see that being afraid of what might happen is actually so bad for your health. Like I said, we all experience fear. It's a normal reaction to something that is alarming. But when it's constant, we do ourselves a huge disservice in our health. So let's dive in. So in human evolution, in fact, in any animal evolution, and we are animals, let's not think that we're special. Fear is quite useful. It spurs the fight, flight, freeze, fade syndrome, which, if you're being chased by a predator, is actually a really good thing to experience. And certainly when you're escaping an issue with another human being that may be detrimental to your health, to your safety, again, it's really important that fight, flight, freeze, fade kick in. And that kicks in the brain. And it kicks in as a response to not feeling safe. But why do we have that response? Well, the human brain has many parts. It's one of the most complex pieces of natural machinery that there is. And that's what sets us apart from our primate cousins, that our human brain developed language. So we can express, I am fearful, I am scared. We don't just have to lash out physically. We've also been able to explore and research and investigate the parts of the brain. Again, sets us apart from the primates. So there is actually an almond-shaped region in the brain, and it's situated next to the hypothalamus, which actually acts as our main center for processing emotions, emotional behavior, and motivation. And this is called the amygdala. Now, the amygdala is very, very important because it sends out neurotransmitters that are the chemicals of fear. I'll just go back a little bit in history. Once upon a time, there was a researcher called Hans Selye. He lived from 1907 to 1982, and he was the founder of stress theory. Selye was the first scientist to identify stress as non-specific signs and symptoms of illness. Now, he said that ongoing stress creates problems in the body, in the physical body. Now, till then, no one had linked up fear and stress with illness. So he was very important in us understanding or comprehending exactly what living in fear could do to the body. Now, certainly on this podcast, we've spoken about the PNEI of trauma. So the psycho-neuro-endoimmunology of trauma. And if you pop back to episode 74, that's the episode we did on that. And that is roughly based on Hans Selye's stress theory. And that says that under increased emotional pressure of the psyche, that the neurological system or the nervous system, so the brain and the nerves, kicks in, changes its state of being, and then that flows on to the endocrine system, so your hormone disruption starts, then that flows on to your immune system, so your immunology changes. And this is what we see when we're confronted with what we are these days in the world. This is our PNEI system kicking in. Under constant fear, which is your P, your neurons change, your neurotransmitters change, your nervous system changes, the reaction of your nerves changes. So that's the N. And then we have an immune response. Now, why do we have an immune response? Because we have these extra neurotransmitters jumping around in our brain, flowing through our adrenals, and our immune system sees that as the invader. Not the thing that we're scared of, but the chemical reaction in the body. So we have an immune response. And this is why we see so much of a spike and increase in illness in times of fear. But let's get back to the brain, because I did say this was a science lesson. So in the brain, we have several parts that are actually involved in a fear response. So we have the thalamus, which decides where to send incoming sensory data. Now that comes from our eyes, ears, mouth, skin, nose. We have our sensory cortex, which interprets that sensory data. We have the hippocampus, which is located down towards the brain stem, and that stores and retrieves conscious memories, processes sets of stimuli, and establishes a context. Then we have the amygdala. Back to the amygdala, which actually decodes emotions, determines threats, and stores fear memories. Just on that, yes, fear can be a memory. So when you're a child, you might smell a cologne or a perfume or a food or petrol. It could be anything. And if something fearful happens at that time, your amygdala stores that memory. And then when you're 40, 50, whatever, and you smell that thing again, fear jumps back in. And we also have the hypothalamus, which actually activates that fight, flight, freeze, fade response that we discussed just before. Now, that little snapshot of parts of the brain really doesn't do it enough justice, because the brain is a complex organ. There's actually more than 100 billion nerve cells in a really tight, intricate network that communicate. And they're the starting point of everything we do, think, feel, say, believe. Some of these react to conscious thought and action, but many are autonomic responses. That is, we don't decide that they happen. And this is where the science of fear kicks in. Some things are out of our control in our brain. These autonomic responses, they're not in our control. But there are some responses that are. And when you recognize that there is a change, you need to take note. Now, some of those physical changes might be you start feeling a bit hot inside or hot in the face. Your skin might start getting a bit itchy. Or it might start to feel like it's burning up a little. You might find yourself getting a little bit irritable. Come on, we've all had those days when You go to the office, someone drops a pencil and you feel like ripping their head off. That's a sign that something's not right. There are other responses we have, like depression, lethargy, melancholy, and these can be responses to fear. And I'll explain why. So there are many chemicals in the brain. The brain is your chemistry center, your chemistry lab of your body. It actually has more chemical reactions happening there than anywhere else in the body except for the gut. Now, why do I say except for the gut? Well, the gut is actually your first brain. Your gut is where your body decides what is happening, and then your brain in your head responds. But we're talking about the brain in the head today. So there's actually a group of 10 molecules and more than 50 neuroactive proteins that form the neurotransmitters that our brain sends around our body and that our gut sends around our body. Now, these chemicals can't determine what their effect is. In fact, that is controlled by a receptor. Now, every chemical reaction in the body involves a receptor. And side note, when we take a lot of big pharma medications, what we're doing is purposefully dulling receptors. And when you dull receptors, your body doesn't get the feedback that it needs to continue the process. So when we're on multiple medications, we can feel like we're going nowhere, like we're stuck on a treadmill for our lives. And that's exactly what you're physically doing to your body. But that's a side note. This episode is not about big pharma or anything like that. It's just to give you information. Now, there are some main processes in the brain, and we actually call them systems in the brain. And some of these chemicals that we create in response to fear, in response to any emotion, actually have their own system. And the main ones are the dopamine system, the noradrenaline system, the serotonin system, and the main one that we know about is cortisol, the cortisol system. And we've all heard about cortisol. That is not our only drug created in the brain. So I did say that fear can cause depression. So let's go through the chemicals that are aligned with depressive disorders, with melancholy, with lethargy. So we have serotonin and norepinephrine. Studies have actually shown that low serotonin levels in the brain can lead to anxiety, irritability, sleep disorders, things that are normally associated with depression. Reduced levels of norepinephrine, which is a chemical responsible for arousal and alertness, can actually lead to fatigue and a general depressed mood. Now, people that have problems with dopamine often also have problems with addiction to alcohol and drugs, because these things can actually stimulate the feeling of dopamine in the body without actually having the natural dopamine. Now, when people are on antidepressants, it's supposed to be that they're increasing the transmission of brain chemicals like norepinephrine and serotonin. But if you look at what an antidepressant normally is, it's called an SSRI, which is a serotonin reuptake inhibitor. So it's actually stopping the natural process of the production of serotonin, the decoding of the message of the serotonin, and then the application of that. So they don't produce any new serotonin. They just slow the breakdown process of the serotonin and norepinephrine And it's supposed to allow the transmitters or receptors in the body to use these chemicals in a more effective way. I don't know how many of you have ever driven out of your driveway with your handbrake on. The car still goes. It's not happy about it. But if you do that often enough, your handbrake breaks. It stops working. You lose an integral part of your car because for so long you had the brakes on and engaged, and then you tried to do something against that action at the same time. So when we dull these receptors, we start telling our body, do you know what? I don't want you to read that serotonin or that norepinephrine. So why don't we just switch you off? Now, I don't know about you, but I don't particularly want really important processes in my brain just switching off. Now, we have chemicals in our body and our brains that make us happy. Now, serotonin, which we just discussed, uses an amino acid called tryptophan. And with that, it helps maintain a process that makes us feel happy, controls mood swings, sleep, anxiety levels. And we also have another chemical called dopamine, which makes us excited, makes us want to talk to people. It controls emotional responses, movements of the body's ability to experience pain and pleasure. And we have acetylcholine, which relates to us feeling happy or experiencing happiness. Acetylcholine also helps us experience arousal, sexual performance. It controls our blood flow down to our private parts. And it's actually believed in scientific research that a happy person has high levels of all of these chemicals. Now, if any of these chemicals in the brain are imbalanced, what do you think is going to happen? Things are going to go wrong. You won't be able to feel happiness. You won't understand pain and pleasure. Your heart rate might become fast. You would become nervous. You might shiver. You can't control your body temperature. You can't control your reactions. The rest of your body will actually interpret all these signals to create fear. So this is internally created fear. But what happens when we experience externally created fear? Well, let's get back to the amygdala. The main substance or hormone that we experience issues with when we're in fear is cortisol. And the amygdala is the area of our brain that signals to our adrenals, which are located just above our kidneys, that cortisol, the stress hormone, must be released. Now, there's a couple of important times in our lives when cortisol is released. So cortisol is released when we're under fear or threat, external. Cortisol is released when we're under fear or threat, internal. Cortisol is released when we are having a change in our life. So for women, that's known as menopause. For men, it's called andropause. But for both, it really should be called adrenopause, because that is when we no longer make all our other hormones in our body, in our private areas, but we make them from the adrenals. Now, till this point in our lives, our adrenals, they're responsible for creating our reaction to fear. And when we live in a deep state of fear, we can exhaust these adrenals, or our receptors, cortisol receptors, can switch off and we can flood our body with cortisol. What does that look like? It looks like that tummy that won't go away, that roundness in the middle of your body, the double, triple chins that just don't go anywhere, the non-restful sleep that you've experienced for 20 years. Excess cortisol can kill. It can kill us physically, emotionally, mentally. Cortisol can be a killer. But when you're not in a constant state of fear and you hit adrenopause, cortisol has an important role to play, and it is supposed to be what you now make your hormones from. Right? So cortisol is a hormone. It's a master hormone, but it's also a sugar. So what happens when you have excess cortisol in your body? Well, what can happen is that your blood sugars increase. Obviously, your body's physicality changes. So there is strain on other parts of the body. But as your blood sugars increase, because cortisol is a sugar, there's too much of it in your body, the receptors dull, and you can find other problems like becoming insulin resistant. You could have type 2 diabetes mellitus. Now, it's not what you're eating that's the problem. Okay, well, sometimes it is. But in most cases, it's because your body is full of sugar in the form of cortisol, and your body cannot distinguish what's going on because all sugars are broken into glycogen, and your body just sees that there's too much sugar. So you think, okay, I'm going to go on a low sugar diet, a low fat diet. I'm going to try and get rid of this tummy. I'm not happy because of the tummy. And the more you think you're not happy because of that, the more cortisol you release into your system. So you're still feeding this cycle. So you go on to a low sugar, low fat diet. And if you're a woman and you're menopausal, that can be the worst thing that you do, because now your estrogen receptors are out of whack and you start getting low estrogen because you can't make your hormones properly in your adrenals. And so then you start getting hot flashes and mood swings. So a lot can happen when cortisol is released. Why does it get bad for some people and not for others in adrenopause? Comes back to the fear you experience in your life, what you do to dissipate that fear. Because the more you release this cortisol before adrenopause, the more chance there is that your receptors aren't working properly. So you can see how everything's tying in here. So the science of fear, look, we could do a 2-hour episode on this and I still wouldn't have even scratched the surface. I'm just giving you some of the basics here. But the science of fear, it's not something we can avoid, but it's something we can lessen suffering from. So what are some main tips I have for you, the listeners, to reduce the effects of cortisol, of epinephrine, of norepinephrine, of all of these wonderful chemicals our body makes? Well, the first thing is, do not choose to live in fear. Now, in an episode that I recently recorded with one of our lovely guests, this guest said that fear could be summed up as false expectation appearing real. And I really, really love that because it's true. It's what we see, the stuff that we're processing could be completely false. Our lives are not in danger from it. There is no predator hunting us down, but it appears that that's real. And especially at the moment in the world, that can be applied. Fear can also be summed up as forget everything and run, or forget everything and rise. So you have a lot of choices when you're experiencing fear. Do you let it boost you into action, or do you let it crumble you into a heap? Because when you let it crumble you into a heap, that's when a lot of other things happen in your body, a lot of other chemical reactions. But if you let it inspire you into action, because you realize it's a false expectation appearing real, and you draw your line in the sand, you become master of your own destiny. Like, I could go on with these phrases. They're out there for a reason. But when you take control of this, you change your internal reactions to fear and you create health. So how do we do that? The first thing I can say is switch off your TV, listeners. It's not telling you the truth. Don't get into fear porn either. So there's a lot of people in the world at the moment that are oversharing lots of stuff and creating this constant fear response. They mean well, but we don't need to see it all. Decide what your line in the sand is. Decide what you stand for. But most of all, decide to do you. You do you, I do me, they do them. That's the way it's supposed to be. Obviously, you can care for your loved ones, your family, your friends, but you have to do you. You have to put yourself first. So turn off your TV is one thing. Get out into nature, even if it's only a 20-minute walk. Breathe in the essential oils from the trees. Wear no shoes. Put your feet in the dirt. Get some minerals through grounding. Get some early morning sun, because that helps you make the good chemicals that you need in your gut to send to your brain to help you sleep at night and to help you cope with the stress of the day. Be well hydrated, but make sure that you have something in the water. Structure your water. And we might do an episode on that later, on structured water. Eat well. If your food is in a packet, it has chemicals. If your food comes from the land, it has less chemicals. Eat well. Stop eating numbers and long names. Go and eat an apple or a strawberry or whatever. But if you can't pronounce all the ingredients in your food, you shouldn't be eating it. Make sure that you breathe. You take time to breathe. Now, if you live in a city, obviously the air won't be as clean, but go to your park. Go for a drive somewhere and go to the beach or the bush or wherever so that you can breathe some cleaner air. But my main tip here is don't live in fear. Fear creates illness. And I've given you a little bit of the science of fear. But that's a merry-go-round you can get off. You just have to make the choice to do so. Very dry episode for you folks, but I thought it was really important to explain some of the science. Like I said, I could make this a 2-hour episode for you. You'd all be asleep in your chairs or wherever you are when you're listening to the podcasts. And I'm not going to do that to you. So I've just given you a tiny, tiny snapshot of the science of fear. Coming up in episodes 97 and 98, we have Gregory and Cox talking about the power of 5 and rebellious wellness. We have many more fantastic guests that we've been super busy recording for you all. Listeners, thank you again for your time. Go forth and create your magical life. Thanks for listening today. Please subscribe to hear future episodes, leave a review, and share this podcast. You can follow us on Facebook, at A Magical Life Podcast or at Holistic Natural Health Australia. That's holistic with a W. You can find us on Instagram at Holistic Natural Health or at www.holisticnaturalhealth.com.au. That's where you'll access all sorts of articles, freebies, and more.